All right. So this video is entitled Luther Was a Nominalist. It's in response to recent videos done by Jordan Cooper in conjunction. He did one independently, and he also did videos in conjunction with Gavin Ortland and Michael Horton, denying that Luther was a nominalist and making the claim that this is just uninformed and academically unsophisticated. And this video is in response to that, to note that this reflects that Jordan simply isn't familiar with the relevant secondary literature on this topic. So what I'm going to do is go through that literature. I'll try to make it where it's not boring, but this is something that's academically technical. But I just ask for you to hang in there because the question is really important. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just go through the secondary literature that shows that Luther was in fact a nominalist, that it influences early and his late thought. And the second thing that I'm going to do is explain what nominalism is. This is part of the problem in disputes over this with Lutherans, because Luther was poo-pooed Aristotelian philosophy, was scathing toward Aristotle. For that reason, there was often, this didn't happen, of course, within Protestant scholasticism, which did have a philosophical focus. But in Lutheranism, in discourse today, Jordan Cooper, for example, his comments reflect that he's simply not familiar with scholastic philosophy, and that's a major problem. And I think that some of that stems from Luther poo-pooing things like that. So there was, of course, scholasticism that developed, a second scholasticism within Protestantism, but he's not familiar with medieval scholasticism and the distinctions between realism and nominalism. In essence, he doesn't really understand what nominalism is, and that's the problem. I'm going to explain that in this video. I'll give a very precise definition, talk about some of the secondary issues related to Pelagianism and how that relates to it as well, and then show the influence of nominalism on Luther's doctrine of justification. So those are some of the things that are going to be covered in this video. So first, just to talk about what nominalism is, this is going to be coming out in an academic article with Nova et Vetera entitled "The Formal Cause of Justification at the Council of Trent," and I interact with the history of realism and nominalism that's central to the thesis of what I'm doing in the paper. So I'm going to be referencing that paper, that academic paper. I would encourage everyone, if you have any interest in academic journals, Nova et Vetera is a great one. And again, I'll have an article coming out in the next few months there entitled "On the Formal Cause of Justification at the Council of Trent." So I'll start with whether or not Luther was a nominalist. And this is something he has suggested, Jordan has suggested, that this is something that was a Catholic apologetic point or something along those lines. Well, that's not true if he means to suggest that it's only Catholics that hold that Luther was a nominalist. The most prominent historical theologian, Protestant historical theologian of the 20th century was Heiko Obermann. And this is central to his thesis in his work, Luther, Man Between God and the Devil. He talks about Luther's training at Erfurt. He also provides quotes where Luther early on refers to Occam as my master, and he makes reference in some of his table talks to the Occamist school, which I have absorbed entirely. So Luther himself, from his own words, he was a disciple of Occam, and so that point is really just stems from Luther's own words. More importantly, and also his training at Erfurt, the training under Trutfetter. Trutfetter was influenced. Gabriel Biel's influence is, of course, important, but Trutfetter was influenced by Jean Buridan, who wrote probably the most sophisticated Summa of Logic in the late medieval period, and he was a nominalist. It was a nominalist account of semantics and logic, and that was deeply influential on Trutfetter and his understanding of logic. So that he was influenced by nominalist is not in question. That he's a nominalist in his thought, early and late, among those that have actually studied this closely, that's not in dispute either. The most prominent study on this is done by Graham White. It's entitled Luther as a Nominalist. This work is out of print. It's published by the Luther Agricola Society. It's not done by a Catholic publisher. I don't believe that Graham White is Catholic. He's a Protestant scholar, to my knowledge. And but his study, the most important thing is his study demonstrates exhaustively that Luther was a nominalist. He covers disputations done by Luther in around 1533, 34, and shows the influence of nominalism on Luther's thought. It influenced his account of semantics, his metaphysics. It's ultimately a metaphysical position that has semantic implications. It has implications on philosophy of nature. It has implications on all of philosophy, because it deals with a fundamental point, something about the fundamental nature of reality. And again, we're going to come back to that. But Graham White demonstrates this exhaustively in that work. This work, Cooper seems to be entirely unfamiliar with this work, but if he's going to make claims about this responsibly, he needs to read it, and he needs to read it closely, because if he hasn't done that, he simply doesn't know what he's talking about. Richard Cross, and he's published with the Oxford Historical Theology series 3 recent exhaustive historical theology volumes on a topic that's dear to him, and he references White's work favorably throughout, because White's Cross is at Notre Dame and is an extremely technically sophisticated scholar who's done work on SCOTUS. He knows this period, and he knows he understands what's going on the philosophical side at a very nuanced level. And his assessment of Graham White's work is extremely positive. And I've read White's work, and it seems that Cooper hasn't. So he hasn't done his homework, and he's out there making claims that this is just something, a Catholic apologetic point. He wouldn't even, this work is unpublished. Again, it's hard to come across. It's hard to obtain. But if he's going to make claims like this, a book entitled Luther as a Nominalist, that's something that he should probably look into and take the time to study before spouting off and claiming that it's just, Catholic apologists that are concerned about this. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So it doesn't require obtaining this out of published work. That he should figure out a way to do that. He should get through his library, he should get the work. But there are also tons of more accessible works that refer to Luther as a nominalist. Bernard Loos talks about the influences on Luther's thought, and he mentions that Ockhamism must be noted as first in influences. Loos is not a Catholic, and he's publishing a work on Luther's theology, an important work on Luther's theology, and he says that Ockhamism is first in influence on his thought. That's before Augustine. So second in the list is Augustine. And the important thing about Graham White's work is Graham White shows that Luther read Augustine as a nominalist. So it affected his reading of Augustine. It also affected his reading of Scripture, which I'm going to talk about later. So again, these claims that it's something that's just a Catholic apologetic point, it's completely ill-informed. Cooper doesn't know what he's talking about on this point. I regret that, but that's the case. There's also another study with I'm going to butcher his name, but Pekka Karkinen, entitled Nominalism in the Via Moderna and Luther's Theological Work in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Martin Luther. This is something that's accessible online. He should probably be able to get this through his academic library if they have access to Oxford series. So he should know about that. Cooper should know about that. Other works are works of Thomas Osborne. He's written an article on the influence of nominalism on Luther's sacramental theology. There's been works on the influence on Luther's theology of the Eucharist. If you have, when I talk about what nominalism is, this will make sense a little bit later. But if you have a particular view of common natures or universal extramental forms that's affected by nominalism, that's going to affect your view of things like the two natures of Christ. It's going to affect your view of substance. These are points that are very critical for the 300s and the 400s for theology and Christology. And so if it's going to affect your theology. So the suggestion that it had no effect on his theology is simply mythology. It's Lutheran mythology. It did have an impact. And studies have shown this. There's been lots of academic studies that have shown this, again, most exhaustively, Graham White's Luther as a Nominalist. So that nominalism shaped Luther's thought is really not in dispute among Luther scholars, people that actually know what they're talking about and published technical academic works on Luther that study this issue closely. The thing that is most obvious that Horton and Cooper seem to reflect no familiarity with, which is really remarkable, is they don't interact with Heiko Obermann's work. This is central to Obermann's account of Luther. Nominalism affected his thought. Obermann doesn't think that this is a bad thing, but that it influenced his thought is central to Obermann's thesis and his reading of Luther. So at the least, get the paperback edition of Luther, Man Between God and the Devil, published by Yale University Press, and interact with that in your video, rather than misleading your audience and suggesting that this is something that is just a Catholic apologetic point. It's not. It's something that Lutheran scholars and Protestant scholars broadly recognize. So that's that first point. The first point is whether or not Luther is a nominalist. Yes, he obviously is. It influences thought. There have been significant academic studies that have shown this. So let's hope that horse is dead and we don't have to beat it any longer. So the second point, what is nominalism? This point is really important because this is something that's not understood by Cooper. He makes reference to things like Pelagianism. Well, Luther did respond to perceived Pelagian tendencies among nominalists that he read. But that doesn't mean that he rejected nominalism. So, for example, there can be disputes within realism, and just because I disagree with one realist on some point, that doesn't mean that I all of a sudden stop being a realist. That's a non sequitur. It's Latin for it does not follow. So that should be an obvious point. Just because he rejects what he held to be Pelagian tendencies, and on the question of whether or not Ockhamism is Pelagian, Rega Wood, in the Cambridge Companion to Ockham, has written a contribution on that and has suggested that it's not inherently Pelagian. This was something that was a major problem among the reformers. They would make these sweeping claims that were historically uninformed. You see this with Martin Chemnitz, calling things Pelagianism that are not Pelagian. Diego Andrada responded to Martin Chemnitz. All of his works are locked in Latin. I've done academic work on Andrada and have a publication coming out that includes his dispute and interaction with Martin Chemnitz. And in that dispute, one of the things he notes responding to Chemnitz is an affirmation of the freedom of the will, an affirmation of the existence of the free will. That is not something that's Pelagian. And these were the sorts of claims that Chemnitz was making early on in his dispute with Andrada. So Chemnitz just didn't know what he was talking about. And that's common. This is something I plan to do further videos. That's a common Protestant move. State things as confidently as possible when you're not well informed about it. And just to be honest, that is very tedious. You mislead your audience. You're pretending like you know about things that you don't know about. And it's just very, very tedious. And so to my Catholic viewers, I think that most of them, if you're well formed, you would just realize you just need to take those sorts of things with a grain of salt. For my Protestant viewers and I'll say my Protestant friends, my exhortation would be that you need to, so on the live stream, hold on one second. All right, please take her out, okay? That was an interruption from my 3-year-old daughter. So to my Protestant viewers, the thing that I would say is that you need to be more circumspect before making these audacious claims. You need to be more circumspect before making claims that you know something that you don't know. I deal with this all the time in comments, and people who don't. I don't say this to boast, but I've done doctoral level coursework in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and other modern languages reading sources in those languages, and I've taught logic at a collegiate level, and I see fallacies all the time, and people making these hyperbolic claims in the comments section that they pretend to know things that they don't. It's, again, it's something that's very tedious. So my exhortation to my Protestant friends who are viewing would be, take some time to reflect on something and think about it before you know, take to pounding the keyboard. Think about what's being said. So this is on the, well, let's see, where are we now? So we're on the second point. I was going to have 3 points. The second point was, what is nominalism? And this is just a long preface to say that it's generally not well understood. It's, there's something, well, Luther rejected the perceived Pelagian tendencies of nominalism, so he's not a nominalist. Well, that doesn't follow. Again, there can be disputes within nominalism, but you can move if it's deeply ingrained. You simply work within a nominalist framework to overturn one nominalist position for another. And what it shows is that those positions aren't essential to nominalism. You can have what he thought it was Pelagianism, or what he thought was a non-Pelagian view, and in both cases be a nominalist. So that addresses that point as kind of a preface to talk about what is nominalism. So to talk about what nominalism is, the first thing I'm going to do is talk about what is realism. And realism is the affirmation that there are, in contradistinction from what's sometimes called conceptualism and other distinctions between what is called nominalism, realism is the affirmation of the extramental existence of universal formal causes. I'm going to explain what that means, but it's the affirmation of the extramental existence of universal formal causes. You might, in scotistic language, also make reference to common natures, but I'm just going to use that former technical language. The affirmation of extramental universal formal causes. So just to give kind of a brief summary and history of this, Plato affirmed that forms exist in the heavens. And this is how you can motivate the problem, is if you look at cups that are, say, 3 different sizes, 3 different colors, and they're made out of 3 different materials. So you've got one that's glass, you've got one that's ceramic. My battery's low. I'm having all sorts of problems. Give me just a moment, please, viewers. I'll be right back. All right, I said I'd be right back. I'm right back. Hopefully I haven't lost anyone. This is how we roll. You won't get anything sophisticated on this channel, at least in terms of the technology. So, so what realism is, we're talking about Plato, the forms existing in the heavens. If you've got 3 cups, they're different shapes, sizes, and materials. They're all different. They all have different sizes. One holds 18 ounces, one holds 12, one holds 6. And they're all, one's metal, one's plastic, and one is, and say one is ceramic. You've got 3 different materials. And then one has and one's blue, and one's yellow, and one's red. So they're different. They're obviously different. They have different colors, volumes that they hold, and different materials. So they're all different. Yet they're all the same thing. We all call them cups. So they are in some way the same and in some way different. In what way are the same and in what way are they different? Plato's means of accounting for this was saying that there is this perfect model of a cup in the heavens, and that everything on earth was modeled off of that. He eventually recognized problems with this that he noted in the Parmenides, and these problems were also recognized by Aristotle, his famous third man argument. And one of the problems was how what's in the heavens has a causal impact on the things here on earth. That perfect cup is, so that's one of the questions. So Aristotle posited that forms exist in the things, that there are formal causes, there are forms within the things that make them to be the same kind of thing. And that was the position of Aristotle. Later scholasticism, Augustine noted that some of the problems in Plato's positions are removed if those things that exist in the heavens exist in the mind of God as exemplar causes. And this language of exemplar causes was used, and exemplarity was used by Bonaventure and Aquinas. There's a good book by Gregory Dulon entitled, um, it's on exemplar causes in Aquinas. Now I can't remember it's on the divine ideas. There's another book on divine ideas in Aquinas. Anyways, there are important studies on this. And so what happened was the scholastics synthesized the positions of Plato and Aristotle and said, yeah, they exist in the heavens, in the divine mind as divine ideas, and they exist in things, because God speaks them into existence. And so they have something that make them the same kind of thing. They have something that they share, and these are formal causes. They're universal. They're one in many. And so that was the scholastic position, and they stem from the one who is the cause of all natures and all created things. Occam denied this. He was not the first to posit that formal causes could be individual rather than universal. Others posited that before him. Not Thomas Sutton. Rega Wood has a good article on a figure who posited this in around the 1260s. I may remember his name. I may look it up, and it's in the article that I'm producing. But Scotus also held that formal causes could be individual. He didn't think that all of them were individual. He held that there were universal formal causes and individual formal causes. It was Occam that made the nominalist move and said all formal causes are individual. He takes his famous razor to it, not multiply entities beyond need, and said that they're all radically individual. What that means is that those three cups, they're not actually the same thing. They're similar. So they're not the same thing. We just give them the same name or noumena, hence nominalism. So that's what nominalism is. That gives you a background, some of the philosophical background and an explanation of what it is. You don't see those sorts of explanations in these discussions. You see reference to Pelagianism and things that are not inherently tied to nominalism. And if Luther rejected those things that don't seem to be inherently tied, well, then he rejected nominalism. And again, that doesn't follow. It's just basic logic. I'm very sorry. It doesn't follow. And it means that you don't understand what nominalism is, or you are just making a rudimentary mistake in logic. So he was a nominalist. Studies have shown this. The fact that he rejected perceived tendencies within certain nominalist figures doesn't mean that he's not a nominalist. So Luther was a nominalist, and that's what nominalist is. Now let's get to the third point. This is the point that I'm very interested in. Those first 2 points are very clear, but I have a section entitled in the article, Luther's Theological Wings. Luther is a nominalist. And what I argue there is that there are 5 different ways that that nominalism influenced Luther's theology. And this is going to be, I should have reviewed this more closely before doing the video, so I'm just going to make a couple of references to it off the top of my head. The main thing that I would mention is that universal causes were communicable on a realist view. It means that the same humanity that is within me is also within you. We share a common humanity, a common nature. There's a formal identity between, that's Albert the Great's language, between the humanity that's in me that's also in you and is also in all of those cups. And that what makes us individual we're materially distinct. And so matter could be understood as the principle of individuation. Accidents, there was actually a dispute within scholasticism around the time between Aquinas and Scotus on these points, on what individuates. There was some differences between Bonaventure and Aquinas. So we share the same thing, but what that means is that those forms are communicable. And that's important because I can have in my mind the same thing that you have in your mind, understanding the natures of things, and we can understand and reason on a logical level because those forms are communicable. They can be in both of our intellects at the same time, and they can be in things. In our intellects, they're not cojoined with matter, and in things they are conjoined with matter. But the reason that relates to justification has to do with how it has to do with the virtue of justice. So on the realist account of justification, to be justified is to be made just. What that means, and this is how this was explored by the scholastics, is that you have the virtue of justice within you. So common to suggestions to the contrary to alternative suggestions, Augustine had an account of habits and virtues. And this is in his early work, it's in his late work in City of God. And he understood justice in terms of order, in terms of right order. I'm not going to get into the details on that. I might mention it in another video. But he understood justice as a virtue, and he had an account of habits. The scholastics developed this. So did Ambrose. Ambrose had and they drew some of this from Cicero, who was drawing some of that was mediated to him, the cardinal virtues through Plato, and then other reflections on the nature of virtues through Aristotle, although Aristotle didn't specifically refer to the cardinal virtues. So the classical philosophy was influential on Ambrose and Augustine, and this was received by the scholastics. It was influential on Jerome. Jerome refers to the cardinal virtues. Among those is justice. And they had a very sophisticated account of justice and the virtue of justice being in the will, but they also referred to something that's called general justice. I'm going to be writing on this academically as well, but it's something that was a justice within the soul. And this was a form within the soul that ordered the soul to love God above all things and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so there was this intimate tie between justice as an order, right order of the soul, and Augustine's ordering of loves, where you love higher goods above lower goods and God above all things. And this was a form that was in the soul of the just, and it was something common that they shared. So you can see the implications for realism and nominalism here. A realist account would say we can have a share in a common justice. Now, one person may be more or less just, so qualitatively, someone can be more just than another person, but the justice formally, in its basic formal identity, is the same. Both people are just. We're not just calling them by the same name; they're both actually just. In a nominalist account, everything is radically particular. Just as I'm not you and you're not me, so my justice is not your justice, and your justice is not my justice. We just call them by the same name. Think about that in relation to Christ and the justice of the justified. I have to either choose, based on the nominalist view, between Christ's justice or mine, because his justice is not mine and mine is not his. There's not anything that they share. So I either have to choose Christ's or I have to choose mine, and they're all radically particular. So I'm just going to choose Christ rather than putting confidence in a justice that's within me. That dichotomy, I have to either choose Christ or choose mine, would have never occurred in a realist framework. Realists like Ambrose and Augustine and Aquinas and Bonaventure. Scotus was a realist. Albert the Great, Alexander of Hales, Philip the Chancellor. No one would have had that view until nominalism developed and birthed out of the mind, the imagination of William of Ockham in the early 1300s. So the reason that Luther's position was a theological novum, as McGrath rightly notes, the reason for that, the reason that the account of imputation that developed, there's differences between his early view of justification, and this is an interesting point, and his the view of justification that developed later in the 1520s and then after the Augsburg Confession in the 1530s that had a primary emphasis on imputation. That later view that developed with an emphasis on imputation, it works from this bifurcation between either the justice of Christ or the justice, our justice. Well, the realist view would be that's a false dichotomy. It is actually Christ's justice that is within us, and we can have a share in it. We can participate in it because it's communicable. It goes back to the point earlier where whether forms are communicable, whether they can be one in many. So if God is the source of all justice, And we can participate in the justice of Christ through his sacrifice. To say, well, it's either mine or yours, it's either got to be God or mine, is a false dichotomy. It's rooted in the divine act, but we can participate in that, and we can cooperate with God's grace, as Trent said against the reformers. So that's the implications of this on Luther's thought. I cover 5 specific points of how it influences Luther's thought in the article, but for those that are interested, I would recommend buying a copy, or better yet, subscribing to Nova et Federa, and you'll get all of the great articles that come out of there. So I hope this video was helpful and clarifies some of the confusion, clarifies first, Luther was a nominalist. Second, what nominalism is and explains it. And third, how it affected Luther's view of justification, the development of a view of imputation that developed out of the later theology of Luther in conjunction with the influence of Melanchthon. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I plan on, because there's so many videos coming out right now from Horton and Cooper and Ortland in conjunction with one another, and because I also promised a video on Gavin Ortland in response to icons, I plan on doing these videos consistently. And so be expecting more videos in the coming days. If this was helpful, if you're interested, please subscribe. And thank you.